With the exception of funerary fragments and archaeological discoveries, images of children are, in the history of things, relatively new. It may surprise one to learn that the representation of the child, other than the figure of the Christ child or the image of the ruler when young, the few surviving portraits of aristocratic children from the Renaissance, and the depiction of children in the imagery of mythology, Cupid, for example. The first figures of children in art can be dated roughly to the 15th and 16th centuries. However, when looking closely at several of these pictures, we notice the children depicted are not exactly children. They seem to be rendered as miniature adults, dressed in adult costumes and given grown-up gestures and expressions. This is notably the case in sacred imagery, before the advent of humanism and the interest given children by new scientific and historical disciplines in the 14th and 15th centuries. With notable exceptions, including the picturing of the child in illuminated manuscripts and Bruegel's encyclopedic painting of the games of children from the 16th century being perhaps the outstanding example, children are simply absent from the canon of Western painting until the early modern period. This paucity of imagery is reflective of the lack of consideration given children in childhood. The history is pretty well known. The child was, until the beginning of the 15th century, simply and literally out of the picture. There are a number of reasons put forward to explain this. In part, it is due to the extremely high mortality rate for children. Before the 14th century, perhaps as many as 50% did not live to see their 5th year. Children were often considered bestial, unable to control their bodies and their emotions, and thus must be kept separate from adults. The doctrine of original sin implied children were corrupt by nature, as Paul claimed in Ephesians, quote, "by nature children of wrath," end quote. Calvinist doctrine concerning the child is well known and often quoted. According to Calvin, their whole nature is the seed of sin. It is true that children of the medieval period were loved by their parents. Many baptized in the church, given family names, came to be protected by particular laws, breastfed and educated by their mothers and buried next to kin. They played with toys. Some were given a formal education, reading instructional books, horn books, or books of prayer, fairy tales, and sang songs, mostly didactic and moralistic content, to correct a sinful nature. As historians of childhood have made known, children in the past were not considered as greatly different from adults, and were not given significantly different treatment. Indeed, the history is well known, and we are indebted to scholars such as Lawrence Stone, de Moss, and Philippe Ary and his important study, Centuries of Childhood, dated to 1960. Well known, but not perhaps well enough remembered. If we were to consider a series of portraits depicting children over time, chronologically dating from the 15th to the early 18th century, we may find a great difference in works that at first blush seem to present the figure of the child in a similar mode and in comparable circumstances. Portraits of Isabella, sister of Charles V, another of Catherine of Aragon from Spain, the first wife of Henry VIII, shown at the age of 11, and Yelizaveta Petrovna, Empress of Russia, as a child. All present aristocratic girls, royal children before the age of adolescence. Each a bust portrait, we see a finely dressed, handsome figure by themselves, silhouetted against a dark, neutral background. Old enough to have their likenesses made, to sit for the artist, remaining still, calm, and engaged, each picture serves as a document, a record of life having consequence. Archduchess Isabella's portrait, dated to the late 15th century, shows the daughter of Philip the Fair in three-quarter view, looking outward, wearing a red dress with a white headscarf, a type of wimple, and a necklace with two pendants hanging around her neck. These features are attributes of her status and her place in the royal family, making known her pedigree, and are emblems of identity having meaning that take precedence over any speaking likeness achieved by the artist. Here the child is, for the most part, still rendered as a small adult, and few characterizing features specific to what we today associate with childhood have been represented. Catherine of Aragon is also shown in three-quarter pose, with a serene countenance looking intently outward, and is dressed in the costume of the period befitting her age and status. Somewhat older, Catherine is represented with her hair pulled back and tied, rendered in a manner making use of shadow and shade to create the illusion of volume and mass. Her appearance is less iconic, more natural, a thing shown to be of this world. Her shadow is cast behind her, to the viewer's left, and in her hand, at the very bottom of the image, between thumb and forefinger, she holds the stem of a single flower, the partially opened bud of a red rose. Some historians read this element as a symbol of her future life, promised in marriage to Henry VII of England. The rose stands as the Tudor rose, and her role as Queen of England. Others interpret the flower as a sign and symbol of childhood itself, a leitmotif alluding to her purity and innocence, as well as to her growth and transformation, a flower yet fully to unfold. In dramatic contrast, Nikitin's portrait of Yelizaveta Elizabeth Petrovna depicts the future Empress of Russia without direct attributes identifying the status of the sitter. Standing before the viewer in half-length pose, a monumental form filling the space of the picture, she is presented as a more animated figure. Staid and self-absorbed, she does not look outward, but slightly down and away from the viewer, with a thoughtful and reflective countenance, as if rendered in situ, without regard to an audience. This depiction of personality in childhood is aided by the artist's use of light and shade, qualities associated with Dutch painting of the period. She has not yet fully emerged from the darkness around her, her left side in heavy shadow, a mode of portraiture displacing an exacting representation of likeness for a more revealing image of inward character and temperament. Distinction should be made between official formal court portraits featuring children, such as Garrier's Anne, Lady Pope with her children, and more intimate examples including Bronzino's depiction of Italian children of wealthy patrician families from the same period. The question is, should ideas about children and childhood be understood to have shifted remarkably during the Renaissance and the beginning of the 16th century? The answer to that basic question is unclear. Some changes happen slowly, over time. What is evident is that at the beginning of the early modern period, we have many more sources with which to explore and explain the conditions of childhood that include the individual lives of particular children. The first biographical records of children were kept by court historians and present the lives of future monarchs. And although this may not have changed during the Renaissance and after, the disciplines of philosophy, history, and science began to consider the child as being wholly separate from adults. Their manners of seeing, knowing, and behaving were considered by philosophers such as Michel Montaigne, John Locke, Fenelon, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, Helvetius, and of course Rousseau. Their writings, many of which examine human understanding in general, and thus rightly begin with the mind of the child, did much to alter perceptions of the child, their particular manners, their capacities and potential. Distinct ages of childhood were expanded, refined, identified, categorized, and explored in terms of understanding and, importantly, to aid the mental, physical, and spiritual growth of children. For Locke, the mind of the child was a tabula rasa, a clean slate, onto which was written the language of culture. Thus education, both in the home and in terms of etiquette and civility, and from books, was deemed extremely important. Generally, recommendations were to be patient and compliant in the education of children, to be flexible and adapt methods and materials to specific needs, abilities, and desires. Francois Fenelon in the 17th century advocated for universal education and for the education of girls. He emphasized play in the games of children as an important aspect of education, just as had Montaigne in the 16th century, who wrote, "Children at play are not playing about. Their game should be seen as their most serious-minded activity." It is true, children were still viewed as creatures without reason, given to rash actions, as Thomas Wright claimed, quote, "following nothing else but that which pleases their senses," end quote. But these habits were closely observed and attended to, and corrected if needed. The birth of a child was regarded, as it ever had been, as a blessing and special event, unlike, surprisingly, birthdays. But now, in the modern age, it became a subject of art. Not only did this sentiment propel an increase in the number of scenes picturing Christ's nativity, but with the growth of the middle classes and the advent of genre painting, representations of the infancy of children became very popular. Children became ever more present in family portraits, indicating a greater importance given to the home and family, their various ages made known through the manner of dress, expression, and by means of symbols such as we have seen, holding flowers or pictured with a bird, a symbol of the soul, of freedom and transformation, inherited from antiquity. The impact of humanist thinking and philosophy on the world of the child cannot be underestimated. Concerned with the concrete experience of the world and the agency of human beings, images of children became a touchstone for humanist claims about human potential and growth, about moral values and human decency. The child was understood to link the past with the future, a type of secular great chain of being, considered in light of the history of civilizations, and our ideas presented in this allegory by Van Dyck, The Four Ages of Man. The subject of the lives of children as independent beings with distinct needs and desires was a very common type of imagery, most especially seen in the art of Northern Europe, in Spain, France, Holland, and Flanders. Northern Renaissance artists, catering to a middle-class clientele, produced scenes of everyday life, pictures in smaller formats, that featured children and the ages of childhood. Many pictures depict children together, independent from adults, free from scrutiny, and engaged in popular pastimes. As much as nature became the principal arena for picturing children in romantic art, and throughout the 19th century, the domestic interior was singled out as the realm of the child in Dutch Baroque painting. The spread of humanist ideas and ideals to Northern Europe through the writings of Rabelais, Erasmus, Shakespeare, Pierre de Ronsard, and others, aided through the introduction of printed literature and the growth in the number of universities, brought into being a culture which valued the home and domestic life as a key component in the progress from a feudal society to the collection of nation-states with growing populations and burgeoning economies. A clean, ordered, peaceful household was viewed as an allegory of a moral and prosperous society. Children were to be well cared for and loved, and the child was to return this blessing by respecting the parent and contributing to the family and its welfare. Before being apprenticed, boys worked outside, in the fields and with the harvest, while girls were expected to contribute alongside their mothers with household chores, cooking and cleaning, knitting and lace-making. The happy result is pictured in genre scenes and portraits by Maïs and Jacob Ochterveld. The home is a place of comfort and sobriety, where children are nurtured to adulthood, becoming themselves loving mothers and fathers. Indeed, this moralizing sentiment is dramatized in images featuring the poor and despondent, the gypsy and the beggar, the figure of the rake, and the female reveler seen in pictures by Franz Hals and his contemporaries. Given interest and provided attention, the wayward child and the growing number of orphans were cared for through the establishment of almshouses and orphanages. Nevertheless, the destitute child was a fact in early modern societies and became a political and social issue, as well as a subject for art, in which the consequences for an ill-managed home or poor education were made known. Jan Steen, a Dutch painter traveling from city to city, is today best remembered for his paintings of boisterous and ramshackle domestic interiors, scenes of beer drinking and bar fights, of disruptive classrooms and melancholic lovers. Steen's The Effects of Intemperance, dated to 1663, is a multi-figure genre scene in which reprehensible acts are shown together with their consequences. A middle-class woman is presented drunken and slumped over sleeping. A pipe has slipped from her hand. One child is seen picking her pocket while others feed a cat the family's evening meal. The housemaid, also without virtue, holds a cup of wine for a parrot to drink, while household items, bread and fruit, spill over the doorstep. The husband and man of the house is depicted on the far right, in the background, giving his attentions to another woman. The image of the peasant and the peasant family, popular in Holland and Flanders, was a type of subject in which the Linnaean brothers, working in France, specialized. Successful and admitted as members to the French Academy, the subject of middle and rural-class families was somewhat unusual in French art. Works such as Visit to Grandmothers, Family Group, and Peasant Family, dated to the middle of the 17th century, are representative of their oeuvre. Unlike Steen, these genre paintings do not present the family as wicked, wrecked, or ruined. Their lower social and economic status is made clear, but they are shown as clean, well kept. The adults are well-mannered and the children quiet, attentive, and respectful. They may be somewhat still and cheerless figures, but not truly unhappy, the home being a place of warmth and refuge. This is also the case when looking at works by the most celebrated French painter of children in the 17th century, Jean-Simeon Chardin. Like his counterparts working in Holland, Chardin represents the domestic interior as a place of comfort and harmony, where children are shown assisting in domestic affairs, learning basic tasks expected of them when adults, or playing games, which are also, as we have come to see, often a didactic endeavor. Eschewing the manners and modes of French Rococo art seen in works by François Boucher, the favorite painter of French aristocracy, Chardin's works nevertheless found immediate favor among academicians, an upper-class clientele, including King Louis XV. Chardin's paintings were reproduced in prints, and his influence was wide-ranging and lasting. Making his mark as a painter of still-life imagery, he challenged himself to execute genre scenes of domestic interiors in which beautifully textured surfaces were conjoined with a sensitivity and quiet elegance imparted to lower-class families and children. In many of these works, he anticipates the ideas and ideals about children and education of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his famous treatise Émile, or On Education, first published in 1762. Briefly, Rousseau believed the child to be inherently good, innocent, and that the evils of society were the cause of moral corruption and misery. Everything is good, Rousseau wrote, as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. The great educator, he claimed, is experience, not books or the schoolmaster. Quote, childhood has its ways of seeing, thinking, and feeling that are proper to it. Nothing is less sensible than to try and substitute our ways, end quote. Deemed impractical and unmanageable by critics, Rousseau advocated the child be somewhat isolated from society, in the country, learning for himself in nature. Indeed, in his best remembered works, We see children by themselves, engaged in games or with toys in a manner that shows them to be self-sufficient. Rousseau advised that the child need not be overly instructed on matters they would best learn for themselves. A boy learns to build making use of simple, uniform elements to create more complex structures. The exercise is shown to be a moment of imagination and reason unfolding in the intellect and will of the child, while importantly, also serving as a didactic lesson to the viewer. It is a piquant genre scene that is without the accoutrement of everyday life, a conceptual abstraction focusing attention on the unfolding drama. The viewer is witness to the value of children at play. Spinning atop the boy in this painting comes to see for himself the scientific principles of balance and angular momentum which keeps the toy in motion and upright. These principles are first understood, Rousseau argued, not as ideas from books and rote learning, but by means of direct experience, and only later in the language of science. Some of these educational triumphs are represented invested with symbolic motifs, such as in Chardin's Boy Blowing Bubbles, a common game of children as it is today and frequently represented in genre scenes of the period. We see Nietzsche's Two Boys Blowing Bubbles from 1670, most probably inspired by Chardin's example. The bubble is an ancient symbol of impermanence and transience, homo bulla, man is a bubble, and was frequently used as a sign and symbol in vanitas still life paintings. A fascinating picture on many levels, Chardin's painting has been studied for its scientifically accurate rendering of light and its reflection on the sphere of the soap bubble. In terms of its pedagogical meaning, we see an older boy showing the trick of blowing bubbles to a younger child, who watches from behind, as the viewer witnesses the simple but effective methodology of children teaching themselves, framed in the domestic theater of an open window. Education was discussed as a key component to a child's developing character and to the character of societies in the writings of Montaigne, Locke, and Rousseau, who wrote, "A child ill-taught is further from virtue than a child who has learnt nothing at all," a statement the truth of which is presented in works by Jan Steen and others representing disorderly schoolhouses run by incompetent masters, populated by students who have recognized the unfit teacher behaving in untoward ways that are a type of mimicry of the adult without conscience or virtue. In a cautionary statement made regarding the fate of modern children and about the advances of human civilization, Rousseau wrote, quote, "We know nothing of childhood, and with our mistaken notions, the further we advance, the further we go astray." End quote. The more society progresses, the further it will estrange the child from himself. The answer is nature. Looking at portraits and genre scenes featuring children painted in the 18th century, we noticed a great number of works which featured the child within the realm of nature and the natural. Painters working in the period such as Philippe Vignon, Jacob Jordians, Chrysabeum, and Thomas Gibson, among others, were influenced and inspired by a variety of sources that promoted nature as an ideal context to situate the painted figure. Chrysabeum's image of Emily and Robert Cecil, dated to 1690, is a work that relies upon established modes of portraiture, together with frequently used symbolic motifs and signs of children and childhood, while at the same time presenting the figures situated within a realistically and fully rendered pastoral landscape. The image of a bucolic, quiet, rustic corner of nature is presented as a complement to and aspect of the social and personal identities of the sitters. The idea of nature as a realm of harmony and bliss dates to antiquity, to the Arcadian realms of Hesiod, Virgil, and Horace, and was revived and reinvented by Renaissance humanists in pastoral poetry, in literary works like Boccaccio's Decameron, in the philosophies of pastoral idealism, and is represented in paintings by Titian and his followers. Like the modern writers of eclogues, Christopher Marlowe and others, inspired by Virgil and Theocritus, painters in 18th century England began to think of nature within the context of a pictorial mode in which humans existed in their true state, in a locus ammonius, a beautiful place, a golden age in harmony with nature and with one another. In Kersebohm's portrait, Robert Cecil is shown with a shepherd's staff and a dog by his side, a direct allusion to the Arcadian realms of the shepherd, the goatherd, and the days of Hesiod's golden age, which are recovered, if only metaphorically, by the image of the child set within the beauties of nature. The girl feeding a doe in Gibson's piquant image is shown acting in harmony with nature, dispelling the institutions of society, albeit keeping its costume. She was seen as a figure of sentiment, acting instinctively, in accordance to human nature. These ideas, as we have seen, were of course inherited by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the first Romantics in the 18th century, but were also expressed in Baroque-era paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Anthony van Dyck in the 17th. It was perhaps the reputation and success of Van Dyck, the Flemish-born artist who became leading court painter in England, remembered best today for his reinvention of the equestrian portrait, who made popular the modes of portraiture emulated closely by artists of the next generation. Placed within a quiet corner of a serene landscape, or often in an interstitial space, on a balcony or at an open window, the figures in Van Dyck's portraits are conceptually associated with the beauties and charm of nature, their characters shown to be humble, compassionate, sentimental, bringing together the ideas and ideals of sophistication and simplicity. His portrait of William II of Orange from 1632 presents the young monarch at the age of 6. An adroit use of signs and symbols makes known the character and personality of the figure, shown in fancy dress against a classical fluted column set within the boundaries of the natural, and with his pet dog. The future king unites ideas of sophistication in breeding and education, the traditions of monarchy suggested by the classicizing architecture, and the quiet manners and humility learned in communion with the subtleties of nature. This iconic program was reimagined by von Honthorst 8 years later in another portrait of William, in which he is shown with few trappings of monarchy, away from the palace, in the heart of bucolic nature, quote, where the heart is free from vice and the mind from error, end quote, as Rousseau would later advocate. Let us also remember that these portraits were greatly influenced by the rise in the popularity of the genre of landscape painting, which had also been awarded in the 17th and 18th centuries greater recognition by the academies of art. Landscapes with figures, mythological and historical landscapes, and landscapes without figures, pure landscapes, helped propel the use of the motif of nature in 18th century portraits and genre scenes featuring children. The picturesque and pastoral imagery presented in works by Ruysdael, Salvator Rosa, and Rubens were well known and admired by Gainsborough, Romney, and Joshua Reynolds in England. Yet it is the qualities of Rococo landscapes of the French school, paintings by Lancret, Largillier, Boucher, and Jean-Antoine Watteau, that may be seen to have been reinterpreted by English artists, most notably the soft focus and texture of Watteau's atmospheric landscapes, disseminated through engravings in the 1730s and 40s, that became a principal mode of depicting nature in the decorative arts. These types of paintings were ever more popular within a culture that experienced a sea change in regard to nature, its beauty and its meaning, paralleling the growth of travel, the advent of the grand tour, and the sciences of archaeology and geology. Different types of landscape imagery, the sublime and the beautiful, the picturesque and the pastoral, were categorized and evaluated according to their aesthetic properties and their psychological impact, a manner of appreciation that paralleled the growth of garden culture in Europe, the opening of royal gardens to the public, the creation of public parks, and the love of private gardens. Portrait of a Girl by Dandridge, most probably Anne, eldest daughter of Sir Jacob Bouverie, 1st Viscount of Folkestone, shared as much with Van Dyck's treatment of the English aristocracy as it did with Boucher's less treatment of verdant nature in his picturing of Madame du Pompadour and her circle. Histories of British painting in the 18th century feature three important artists, Thomas Gainsborough, George Romney, and Joshua Reynolds, the oldest of these three contemporaries and the first president of the British Royal Academy of Art, founded in 1768. Each of these figures made their reputation as portrait painters, and each can be seen to have dedicated a large portion of their production to the representation of children and childhood. Many of these paintings are today remembered as canonical and rightly stand as emblems of an age. George Romney was trained professionally, traveled abroad to Paris and Italy, but never became a member of the Royal Academy, refusing to apply and never exhibiting there. Nevertheless, his talent attracted a fashionable clientele, and after 1770, his career as a professional was solidified. Commissioned for numerous portraits featuring mothers with their children, works such as Portrait of Mrs. Anne Carwardine and her eldest son Thomas, and Mrs. Henrietta Morris and her son John from the 1780s, present the type of pictures for which he became best remembered. These half-length intimate portraits depict figures in a manner less formal than did Van Dyck's exemplars, and present a highly personal psychological relationship between mother and child. Romney's images seem to represent the bond between parents and children, not as one of pedigree, heredity, and inheritance. Rather, by means of pose, subtle gestures, and expressions, an emotional bond, one of sentiment, affection, and love, is conveyed. These pictures establish conventions of subject, format, or composition and style that both flattered the sitters, were idealized to some effect, while presenting inward qualities of tenderness and care related to identity and the true nature of familial relations. An outstanding example, differing from those we have seen through the addition of a playful narrative, shows Lady Anne Barbara Russell sitting, looking out at the viewer and wearing a green dress as she helps balance her son Henry, holding on to his sash as he stands on a table regarding himself in an oval mirror. The fact that Henry is not presented directly, that we see his face as a reflection, is no mere novelty. The mirror, a multivalent symbol often recognized as an emblem of vanity or deception, is here configured as a means by which the child comes to understand the reality of himself as a separate, distinct being, a stage of development in the perception and cognition of childhood. Romney has adopted the principles of pedagogy put forward by John Locke and Rousseau, and that had been represented in works by Chardin and Steen. The child at play is presented in the context of nature and the natural, acting as children do, in an environment best suited to their interests and temperament. Nature as teacher is succinctly presented in Romney's allegorical and historical portrait of Shakespeare as a child, nurtured by the figures of nature and passion. To a degree greater than Romney, Thomas Gainsborough made use of elements of landscape and nature as a key feature of his portraits. Although not a dedicated landscape painter, his early efforts did not provide an adequate living wage for his new family. Throughout his career he returned to the genre, executing large-scale landscapes and genre scenes featuring the imagery of the countryside, parks, and private gardens. He has been credited by some historians as the founder of the modern school of British landscape painter, and the mentor to artists such as Constable and Turner. After moving to the resort city of Bath, known for its Roman-built baths and proximity to the coast, Gainsborough found a fashionable clientele and began painting portraits based upon his study of Rubens and Van Dyck. From Bath he submitted works for exhibition in London, first with the Society of Artists of Great Britain, and then at the Royal Academy, of which he was a founding member. Perhaps he did not enjoy the pretense and conceit of his wealthy mannered patrons, and is remembered as somewhat dissatisfied as a painter of portraits, developing a strained relationship with the Academy and its members, writing he wished instead to take his violin and walk, quote, to some sweet village where I can paint landscapes and enjoy the fag end of life in quietness and ease, end quote. Moving to London with his wife and two daughters, Gainsborough became the leading painter among his peers, creating a mode of portraiture incorporating landscape imagery more fully into his compositions. Early examples of portraits such as Anne Ford from 1760 were reimagined after moving to London and influenced by French Rococo artists Boucher and Watteau. Gainsborough created portraits in which landscape features were depicted as the principal context in which to situate the figure, representing nature and the natural in a softly rendered textural mode borrowed from Watteau's atmospheric examples. His best remembered works are said to have been quickly executed with a light palette and facile brushwork, blending aspects of the figures with elements of nature, creating visual and conceptual harmonies for which he became famous, popular, and extremely successful. The full-length portrait, Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheraton from 1787, shows Elizabeth Sheraton as a life-size figure seated on a rock, looking out toward the viewer within a lush, verdant, if somewhat wind-blown landscape. Like the artist, Mrs. Sheraton was a musician, a trained professional, who abandoned her career after marriage. Her passion for music was known by the artist, and this sensibility is expressed in the work through the musical effects of color harmonies and layered brushwork. The figure is presented somewhat disheveled, alone, away from society, and within the beauties of nature, portrayed as relaxed, with crossed legs, her hair and scarf blowing in the breeze. Her temperament as a musician and artist is presented as a key feature of character in the portrait, matched perfectly with pastoral qualities of nature. She is shown in her natural state, as a person of intelligence, imagination, and creativity, with an informal, effortless grace, sophistication, and simplicity that are conjoined with the subtleties of nature and expressed by means of the agency of art. It would be interesting to examine more carefully Gainsborough's musical aesthetics. Elizabeth and Mary Lindsay, pictured in this portrait, dated to 1772, were sisters of a musical family in Bath. They are depicted as full-length, life-size figures. Having set aside for a moment the accoutrement of music, Mary looks directly, pointedly at the viewer, while Elizabeth, in this playful narrative performance, gazes thoughtfully into the landscape. In this portrait, the conditions of music, thought to be a universal language to which we respond instinctively, and the beauties of nature and the qualities of landscape which is shown responsive to human needs and desires, are combined in a portrait representing felicity and the bonds of sisterly love. Gainsborough was perhaps not the great painter of children like his peer George Romney. His portraits nevertheless express contemporary ideas about children and childhood, and make use of garden landscapes and parks as an ideal milieu for representation. The four children of Charles Marsham, first Earl of Romney, are presented playfully within the bounties of nature, a realm intended to be taken as the gardens of the family estate. Gathering hazelnuts with their pets, each child is shown to act differently, yet spontaneously, with nature and with one another, their bodies literally blended through compositional and stylistic effects with the features of the natural. Like many artists, Gainsborough frequently represented his own children, and when doing so, unfettered by the academic strictures of commissioned works, he was free to fully express his own ideas as well as more deeply explore and render the character and personality of the sitters. In this remarkable genre portrait, the eldest, Mary, holds the hand of her sister, Margaret, who reaches with the other for a butterfly. They are stepping forward into the world of the natural, exploring the wonders of the environment for themselves, learning through experience, as Rousseau had recommended. The image presents a didactic moment by means of a commonly understood symbol, the butterfly, an emblem of the transience and fragility of life. Childhood is fleeting, and yet the importance of this stage in life is long-lasting. Concentrating, fixed on the flight of the butterfly, the girls are absorbed in the experience, not at all presenting themselves for public attention. This is a private work in which the unfolding drama of nature's lessons are illuminated by a theatrical light source. The image is idealized, with the figures and the landscape presented as visionary models, expressive of what one historian has called natural supernaturalism. More intimate still is a portrait of Mary and Margaret dated to 1859, showing the pair as half-length figures, pressed closer to the picture plane in a loving embrace. Again eschewing the straightforward manners required of formal portraiture, social propriety and conscientiousness, the sitters are twinned, ephemeral, almost angelic forms, wearing similar costumes and given complementary poses and expressions. This theme is retained in a dynamic double portrait from 1863 showing Mary and Margaret at the ages of 14 and 13. Young adults they are shown learning the skills of draftsmanship, which along with letters, music, and dancing, together with domestic skills, is an art d'agrément pertaining to aspects of a young woman's education, preparing them for their lives as adults. They learn the basics of art by first learning to draw, the fundamental component of art. The pedagogy involves first copying statues kept in the studio, mastering different features of the object from different perspectives. This is a process in which one learns by mastering different aspects of the whole and then combining them to form figures, then placing different figures together and creating narrative. Gainsborough has presented this activity, learning the basics of artistic creation, as an allegory of the development of the faculties of perception, cognition, reason, and judgment, fundamental to the growth of the mind of children in their emergence as adults. The girls are presented as a pair, but visually and conceptually quite differently. Mary is wistful, distant, turning from the viewer shown in profile, facing the statue they copy with a preoccupied, somewhat languid countenance. She is the inward figure of imagination, while her sister, looking out at the viewer of the portrait, more consciously responding to the world outside of her thoughts, is the figure of recognition. The artist has presented a wonderful image of the twin qualities of imagination and its creative potential. Mary is lost in thought while Margaret holds the drafting tool in her hand, positioned over a portfolio of drawings we see on her lap. Figures of children in Gainsborough's art are best remembered in a type of imagery he referred to as fancies, a subcategory of genre painting in 18th century art today called fancy pictures, a term coined by Joshua Reynolds when describing several of Gainsborough's examples produced late in his career. Seen here in an example by the Italian Piazzetta, fancy pictures were genre scenes typically featuring middle or lower class children or women, often presented with a whimsical narrative or imaginative storyline. These pictures appealed to a middle-class market for art and were often engraved for wider distribution. This type of imagery was not new, not an invention of Gainsborough, and may be seen to have been executed by Chardin and Watteau in France, as we have seen, Rembrandt in Holland and Murillo in Spain. Cottage Girl with Dog and Pitcher, 1785, as well as what Reynolds called the best work Gainsborough ever painted, Girl with Pigs, from 1782, feature a lower-class child in a manner intending to appeal to the sentimental affections of the viewer. Not all fancy pictures depended upon the sympathy of viewers regarding a poor, wayward, unfortunate child deserving the advantages of upper-class wealth or status. John Russell's example shows a young girl with a basket of cherries, while lifting a clump for the viewer to see. As we know, cherries have an ancient and weighty symbolism. They are the fruit of the Virgin, associated with innocence, purity, and spiritual renewal. Russell has given the image a somewhat erotic quality, in keeping with the traditions of the genre as practiced by English painters of the period. Turning to look at Gainsborough's so-called Blue Boy, dated to 1770, a well-known image today, often reproduced, presents the figure of a young man in an historical costume of the 17th century, standing proudly in a manner intended to remind his contemporaries of portraits by Anthony van Dyck, and is thought to be Gainsborough's homage to Van Dyck. The figure pictured has not been identified. Blue Boy is also said to have been Gainsborough's response to his rival Reynolds, the president of the Royal Academy, who advocated for the use of warm colors, keeping the use of cool colors, blues, gray, and green, to a minimum. Indeed, the relations between Sir Joshua Reynolds and his peers and rivals, Romney and Thomas Gainsborough, is a matter of historical record. An intriguing history, the details which involve the provenance of Blue Boy are perhaps best left for another time. Through frequent exhibition, countless reproductions, including sculptural, the, quote, far-famed painting was described as Gainsborough's masterpiece when exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1896. Although the reputation and admiration for Gainsborough and Romney were well established, their legacy assured by the 1890s, more than a century after the founding of the British Academy of Art, it is the figure of Joshua Reynolds, founding member and first president of the Royal Academy, elevated to knighthood in his lifetime, head of the most prolific and influential studio in England, who is rightly celebrated as the patriarch of the modern British school. Reynolds wished nothing less than to help create a tradition that would elevate the arts of England in a manner to rival the schools of ancient Greece and Rome, to contend with the academies of art long established in Italy and France, and most recently in Holland and Flanders. Reynolds advocated for creating works in the grand manner. Like Romney and Gainsborough, known for his many portraits of the wealthy and powerful, unlike them, he painted numerous large-scale works featuring historical narratives. Well educated, from a family of educators, himself a scholar interested in the history of ideas, he executed paintings of religious and mythological subjects. He traveled widely, especially in his youth, first to Spain and North Africa, and then to Italy, visiting Rome, Florence, Venice, Bologna, and of course Paris. Interested in the history of aesthetics and aesthetic theories, his lectures given at the Royal Academy of Art were renowned and are preserved and studied today. Reynolds is the mountain of British art. Historians have, over the years, cherry-picked select works deserving of ultimate praise. Celebrated British historian Simon Schwammer called Portrait of Omai, quote, one of the greatest things British art has ever produced, and one of the all-time, timeless masterpieces that painting can produce, end quote. I'm not sure why. An interesting comment from an important figure. I'll have to check it out. The historian E.K. Waterhouse thought the portrait of the Marlborough family the most monumental achievement of British portraiture, while Thomas Lawrence, the great painter of the generation following Reynolds, singled out the portrait of Sarah Siddons as, quote, indisputably the finest female portrait in the world, end quote. It's difficult not to agree. Lawrence was an incredible painter, and artists are the true arbiters of taste. His paintings of children are no less remarkable. Working before Wordsworth and William Blake, perhaps Reynolds should be thought of as the first poet of childhood. His many pictures and portraits of children sing out as a child who is father to the man. Looking at early examples, painted when beginning his career in Pimpton in the county of Devon, and after first moving to London in 1752, works such as Thomas and Martha Neat, Amabel and Mary York, and Susanna Hoare and her child, from the 1750s and 60s, works indebted to Van Dyck's 17th century models. Little prepares us for the stunning reimagining of the child presented in the portrait of Lady Catherine Howard, dated to 1778. Lady Caroline Howard, named after her mother, daughter of Frederick, the fifth Earl of Carlisle, is presented by the artist at the age of 7. In this work, Reynolds has abandoned the darker palette of his early portraits, those inspired by Dutch Baroque painting and Van Dyck's examples, and has depicted the child in a vast landscape, seen by the artist in the works of Italian Renaissance painters, Titian and Raphael. It is a type of Arcadian springtime landscape, clear, tranquil, and secure, a garden environment befitting a child of 7 shown by herself. Catherine is presented as a life-size figure, a pyramidal, stable, monumental, indeed noble form, in keeping with Renaissance exemplars, shown wearing a white dress suggestive of innocence and purity, with an aquamarine sash over which we see a dark coat open at the waist. She looks towards a grouping of roses in a planter, and reaches out to touch a stem, perhaps to examine more closely the beautiful flower shown in full bloom. Flowers are a common motif in painted portraits, most especially those of children, and particular flowers are made use of according to the language of flowers and their symbolic meaning. Roses are the flower of Venus and the Graces, and are symbolic of beauty, chastity, and love. Yet Reynolds has also alluded to an association between the figure and the forms of nature that is more material and descriptive in terms of childhood and its development. Catherine, at the age of 7, has come into bloom. Truly no longer a child, by herself, out of doors, she has reached the independent age of adolescence, a springtime in the life of a child where one's sensations and perceptions are engaged and enriched by a growing intellect and understanding. A portrait that in many ways goes beyond the formalities of description. This communion with nature, given the sanctimony of a religious ritual, is also a pedagogical moment. Reaching out and touching the flower, the child learns through direct experience, and again by herself, according to Rousseau, what children learn best by themselves. Nature is responsive to human needs and desires. This formula was repeated with great success in numerous works, with subtle or great variations. The portrait of Master York is conceived as a genre scene. The playful interaction between the child and his pet is yet another work in which nature is presented as an ideal realm of being and becoming for children. This accord with nature is expressed poignantly in Lady Elizabeth Delmay and Her Children from 1779, making use of landscape features associated with pastoral poetry and timeless beauty. It is a work executed in the grand manner. The image is intended to invoke the majestic pyramidal forms of Madonna and Child in pictures from the Renaissance. Nevertheless, the figures are presented with distinct, nuanced personalities, seen especially in the shy deportment of the youngest child, and the group is shown in an informal narrative moment. At the same time, he never abandoned established conventions of Baroque precedents, placing sitters against scumbled backgrounds, on balconies, or against open windows. He frequently included the motif of an exotic bird, the parrot, an emblem of the mode of mimicry employed by children when learning something new. Let us not forget the happy child is the result of a strong, loving, nurturing mother who in Reynolds' many pictures is depicted as the champion of modern life. Her identity, qualities to which portraiture is most responsible, is represented as fused with the family in a world of harmony and bliss. Like his counterparts, Reynolds also created works featuring children presented in a narrative or allegorical context, genre scenes, with moralizing themes formatted on a smaller scale and intended for a broader-based audience. These fancy pictures were often reproduced and sold as an engraving. thus becoming his most popular works. Many are remembered today through their use in the decorative arts. Compositions such as Strawberry Girl, The Little Rogue, and Girl Laughing are similar to Gainsborough's in terms of presentation and theme, as well as to the French artist Jean-Baptiste Greuze. These artists intend to move the viewer's sentiment and feeling. They are intimate images capturing the character of a moment, often revealing the idiosyncratic, whimsical qualities of a child's personality. In a most remarkable image, Reynolds has represented the head and face of 5-year-old Frances Gordon in differing modes of expression from different perspectives, capturing the ever-changing aspects of the child's expressive personality and character. Shown against an airy, atmospheric background, some of the heads have been given cherub wings. More properly thought of as a study for a finished painting, the canvas was exhibited to the public with the title A Child's Portrait in Different Views, Angels' Heads. The beauty, charm, and grace of the picture rivals depictions of angels in paintings of Raphael and his followers, albeit in rarefied form, an illusion the artist cultivated. The painting Angels' Heads remained in possession of the family. Frances never married, and it was given to the National Gallery after her death in 1831. Maybe she was an angel. The work is expressive not only of the changing character of children in childhood, of Reynolds' admiration for and study of cherubs and angels in Renaissance works by Italian artists, but also of the painter's aesthetic ideals, namely the science of beauty presented in the philosophy of Neoplatonism. Reynolds inherited a lifelong love of learning from his father Samuel, a reverend in the Church of England and also the master of the school in Plimpton. It was Samuel who gave his son his first commonplace book, a type of elaborate diary to keep notes, write extracts, and make sketches. As a student, Reynolds came under the influence of Zachariah Mudge, an English clergyman known for his sermons and his deist or Platonist philosophical views. Reynolds valued his association with Mudge and began to study the philosophy of the ancients, writing lengthy extracts from the works of Theophrastus, Seneca, Plutarch, from Homer and Ovid, copying passages from the works of Shakespeare and Milton, as well as from 17th century Platonists, including Shaftesbury, the poets Dryden and Pope. He came under the influence of the great lexicographer and literary critic Samuel Johnson. His notebooks included passages from the writings of Leonardo da Vinci and other art theorists. He owned a copy of Jonathan Richardson's Essay on the Theory of Painting, published in 1715, in which he made numerous annotations. Like Richardson, Reynolds believed the purpose of art to be much more than decorative. It was an intellectual pursuit and a means to understand the human condition. Not educated at university, Reynolds was nevertheless a scholar, a fact made known by his own discourses, lectures given at the Royal Academy, and which are now published. I'm not sure how scholars of Reynolds' paintings have treated his art in relation to Neoplatonic ideas, but they are definitely manifest, most especially in works such as Angels' Heads, a composition he reworked on several canvases. He would have been influenced most profoundly by the writings of Shaftesbury, the poetry of Dryden and Pope. Writing in the 17th century, these figures revived the philosophy of Neoplatonism, making use of Renaissance sources, including Marsilio Ficino, for modernity. Briefly, Neoplatonic philosophy is a type of theistic mysticism holding that the physical world is a copy of an ideal reality, emanating from a divine source, the One, eternal and unchanging. According to the poets Dryden and Pope, artists must not simply copy nature, but rather imitate its beauty, idealizing what is seen, and bringing the material present in closer relation to the spiritual. Neoplatonist ideas were advanced in England first by the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, and then later by Thomas Taylor, called the Platonist, who translated and commented on Plato and Neoplatonic thinkers, making their works accessible to a wider audience. Taylor's translations and commentaries were published beginning in the 1780s and throughout the first decades of the 19th century. Introduced first to Platonic idealism through Mudge, Reynolds would have been further inspired by his trip to Italy and his experience of the Renaissance masters. He copied numerous works seen in Italy, including Raphael's iconic School of Athens. Like his contemporaries, he was an admirer of Rembrandt's art and made copies of Rembrandt's paintings, making reference to them in his own works, such as this self-portrait, intended for display in the halls of the Royal Academy, which owes much to Rembrandt's homage to Homer. Reynolds called Michelangelo, quote, the Homer of painting, and a bust of Michelangelo by Volterra is seen juxtaposed to Reynolds in the self-portrait. Reynolds was a theorist. Wishing to elevate the achievements of British art, he advocated to students the emulation of past masters and placed himself within their traditions. His philosophy of beauty is expressed by the allegorical figure of Theory, a painting also destined for the halls of the British Academy of Art, not only through her appearance youthful and beautiful, but by her looking heavenward, to the divine source of earthly creation. It is also expressed, let us say classically, in his paintings of religious and mythological subjects. Virgin and Child with the infant St. John presents the image of the Virgin Mary in a manner borrowed from Italian painters he admired, and within the context of the aesthetics of beauty and the ideal put forward by Neoplatonist thinkers. The physical beauty and purity of the Virgin was expressive of virtue, and thus manifest a closer relation to truth and the divine mind. The idea, as historians of Platonism have said, quote, what is good is beautiful, and what is beautiful is good, a reflection of Keats' now famous couplet, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. A belief, according to Neoplatonists, discovered through intuition, imagination, and the medium of art. These ideas helped propel the rediscovery of myth and mythological subjects in art in the Renaissance and after, most especially in the figure of Venus, the goddess of beauty and love. While Reynolds painted few mythological compositions, he did represent the figure of Venus in several works, one now shown entitled Venus and Cupid, dated to 1785. Also indebted to Renaissance examples, Titian and his School. Reynolds' Venus is a symbol of spiritual and heavenly love, a Platonic love, making known the agency of art to lift the imagination and inspire communion with the divine source and the spiritual realms in an ascendancy to wisdom, enlightenment, and salvation. Reynolds painted few figures of the idealized nude, one notable exception being Simeon and Iphigenia from 1780, a popular story taken from Boccaccio's Decameron. Simeon, a wild, uncultured man, gazes upon the beauty of Iphigenia while she sleeps in a secluded corner of nature. This vision transforms Simeon, leading to his cultivation of virtue and a more civilized mode of being. A subject engaged by Rubens and Dutch artists in the 17th century, it was reimagined by Reynolds and his circle, including Angelica Kauffman's canvas dated to the same period as Reynolds' composition. Once again, Reynolds has expressed his Neoplatonic ideal of beauty as a means by which art can transform the material world and lift the soul in contemplation of truth and beauty manifest by the divine source of all things. Reynolds' aesthetics of beauty, as we have seen, is not confined to sacred, allegorical, or mythological subjects, but is presented in secular works, his genre scenes and portraits. This includes, of course, his many representations of children and childhood. Defined as different from adults by philosophers, poets, and educators, and understood by Rousseau as pure and innocent, the child in Reynolds' art is expressive of his Neoplatonic aesthetics, is a figure much like Venus or Iphigenia. The experience of the child, particularly in early childhood, their perceptions and their curious and uncorrupted natures, may be seen as closer to the divine source of things. This is most surely the case with his most famous picture of a child, a work now called Age of Innocence. Perhaps a portrait, although scholars have long debated the name of the sitter. The work in history has been viewed as a genre scene, a fancy picture, called by some a subject painting, not depicting a particular child, but the idea of childhood. Most probably first exhibited to the public with the title Little Girl or The Little Girl, dated to 1785 or 1788, there are, in fact, like other so-called subject pictures, angels' heads, for example, two versions of Age of Innocence, one said to have been executed by studio assistants. The figure of a girl, depicted as having outgrown infancy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, is seated directly on the ground in the immediate foreground of the picture plane within a pastoral or Arcadian landscape. Represented in perfect profile, she looks out purposefully into the world of nature, lifting her hands to her chest, over her heart. Seated and barefoot, she communes directly with nature, and is, allegorically, a child of nature, as pure and innocent, as free, simple, unspoiled, artless, if you will, as the realm she occupies. A monumental form filling the space of the canvas, she is seated between the realms of darkness and light, with her back to the trees and looking out to a lighter landscape. A metaphorical conceit, the little girl is an interstitial figure. At the age of adolescence, she is at the threshold of a wider world. She sits bolt upright, without the trappings of society, specific clothing or jewelry identifying her relation to family or her social status. Wearing a white dress with a pink sash, she is symbolic of childhood itself. It would be difficult to underestimate the impact this painting had on the public. Much admired when first seen, the composition, as mentioned, was copied by assistants. The work was also reproduced for wider distribution through engravings made in the 18th and throughout the 19th century, the best of which, in my opinion, is Joseph Grossere's Age of Innocence from 1794. It was Grossere who gave the painting its name, Age of Innocence, an appellation and its intended allegorical meaning, which may be seen to have come to define an age, not only of the child in Reynolds' painting, but of the beginnings of our modern understanding of the nature of children, and of humanity, and its course in history. Reproduced in prints, the image was made use of in countless types of ephemera, and when given to the National Gallery in 1847, then moved to the Tate Museum in 1851, the work was copied in full scale no less than 300 times by artists before the end of the 19th century. The Age of Innocence announced the birth of the child. Before the great poets of childhood, Wordsworth and Blake, before the advent of the full-blown romantic child seen in the art of Philip Otto Runge, Goya, and others, Reynolds presented the face of the child for modernity. The sign and symbol of children as angelic, their character pure, their existence a blessing, their faith as new, as Emily Dickinson said, is as ancient as art itself. The idea of a child as innocent, born free of the chains of man and of social institutions, having its own particular ways of seeing and thinking, much different from adults, which were recognized to develop over time in stages, a result of inborn instinctual means and learned cultural habits, studied according to principles and procedures, and that this process may be understood to recapitulate the development of mankind. All of this is new. Propelled by the 18th century cult of sentiment, the aesthetics of the ideal and the revival of Neoplatonism, Reynolds's images of children would inspire succeeding generations of artists, and our appreciation of these pictures, our understanding of the heavenly origins and beauty of children, bring us closer to and help facilitate an accord with the divine. The painting is an offering, and our admiration a prayer, for children, for childhood, for the virtue of beauty which characterizes both our beginnings in the world and our end.